What if I told you that somewhere in the dusty corners of an abandoned estate in Salem, Massachusetts, sits a grandfather clock that hasn't ticked forward in over 70 years? What if I told you that this clock doesn't just tell time, but reveals truth in the most horrifying way imaginable? And what if I told you that the last family to own it disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only bloodstains and a note that simply read, "The clock knows everything"? This is the story of the Whitmore clock, a timepiece so cursed that no museum will display it, no collector will buy it, and no family member will claim it. Today, we're going to uncover the dark truth behind this mechanical nightmare that drove an entire bloodline to madness. The year was 1853, when master clockmaker Heinrich Zimmermann received the strangest commission of his life. Margaret Whitmore, matriarch of one of Salem's most prominent shipping families, approached him with an unusual request. She didn't want just any clock. She wanted one that would ensure her family never lied to each other again. You see, the Whitmore fortune was built on lies. Lies to business partners, lies to the government, lies to their own family members. Margaret had discovered that her late husband had been embezzling from their children's inheritance for decades, funding a second family in Boston that none of them knew existed. The betrayal had torn their world apart, and Margaret was determined that no Whitmore would ever deceive another family member again. Zimmermann was known throughout New England for his eccentric inventions. He had created clocks that chimed different melodies based on the weather, timepieces that ran backwards during eclipses, and music boxes that played songs no one had ever heard before. But Margaret's request pushed even his boundaries. "I want a clock that knows when someone is lying," she told him, sliding a small fortune across his workshop table. "I wanted to punish deception." What Margaret didn't know was that Zimmermann had been experimenting with something far darker than clockwork. He had been studying the occult, convinced that mechanical precision could be combined with supernatural forces to create something truly extraordinary. Her request was the perfect opportunity to test his theories. For 6 months, Zimmermann worked in secret. He crafted the clock's case from wood taken from the Salem gallows, where accused witches had met their fate. The gears were forged from metal that had been buried in Salem's oldest cemetery for exactly 1 year. And the pendulum, the most crucial piece, was made from a fragment of mirror that had belonged to Bridget Bishop, the first woman executed during the witch trials. But the most disturbing component was the clock's face. Instead of numbers, it bore the names of the 12 apostles, with Judas Iscariot positioned where 12 should be. And carved into the center, almost too small to read, were the words Veritas Temporis, truth of time. When the clock was finally delivered to the Whitmore estate, Margaret was delighted. It was beautiful, standing nearly 8 feet tall with intricate carvings of angels and demons spiraling up its dark wooden frame. She had it placed in the main hallway where everyone would see it as they entered the house. The first sign that something was wrong came during dinner that same evening. Margaret's eldest son, Thomas, was telling the family about his day at the shipping office when they all heard it. The clock's ticking began to slow down. Not just slow down, but reverse. Tick, tick, tick became K-I-sit, K-I-sit. Thomas stopped mid-sentence, his face pale. The truth was, he hadn't been to the shipping office at all. He'd spent the day gambling away more of the family's money at the harbor taverns. As the clock continued its backwards rhythm, the words tumbled out of him like a confession at gunpoint. Every lie, every debt, every shameful detail of his day. Margaret was horrified, but also fascinated. The clock had done exactly what she'd asked for. Over the following weeks, the Whitmore family discovered that the clock's power was absolute. Whenever anyone spoke a lie within the house, the clock would begin ticking backwards, and the liar would be compelled to tell the truth. Not just the immediate truth, but often truths they'd never intended to reveal. Thomas's wife, Sarah, learned that he'd been unfaithful with 3 different women. Margaret's daughter Elizabeth was forced to admit she'd been slowly poisoning her husband with small doses of arsenic because she wanted to inherit his separate fortune. The youngest son, William, confessed to killing a dock worker who had threatened to expose the family's smuggling operation. Each revelation was accompanied by the clock's relentless backward ticking, a sound that began to haunt their dreams. But the most terrifying aspect wasn't the clock's ability to expose lies. It was what happened to the lies themselves. You see, when the clock ticked backwards, it wasn't just counting time in reverse. It was literally undoing the lie, unraveling the false reality that had been created. And in a house built on decades of deception, this began to have catastrophic consequences. The first physical manifestation occurred 3 months after the clock's arrival. Thomas, after being forced to confess to years of embezzlement, began to age rapidly backwards, not becoming younger, but unbecoming the person his lies had made him. His hair fell out, his teeth loosened, and his skin began to sag, as if all the false confidence and stolen wealth were being stripped away from his very being. Sarah, forced to confront the truth about her marriage, started speaking in reverse chronology. She would begin conversations with what she was about to say tomorrow, and end with what she'd said years ago. Her mind had become trapped in the clock's backwards flow. Elizabeth, whose attempt to murder her husband had been exposed, found that her own body began to poison itself. The arsenic she'd been administering appeared in her own system, as if the clock was reversing the direction of her crime. But young William suffered the worst fate. After confessing to murder, he began to experience the death of his victim over and over again. Every night, he would go through the man's final moments, feeling every blow, every sensation, every emotion, but in reverse, from the moment of death back to the beginning of the fight. Margaret watched in horror as her family disintegrated before her eyes. She tried to have the clock removed, but it seemed to have become part of the house itself. The movers she hired would become confused and forget why they'd come. The clockmaker who had created it claimed he'd never seen the piece before. The final entry in Margaret Whitmore's diary, dated November 13, 1854, reads, "The clock has begun ticking backwards constantly now, even when no one speaks. I understand what it wants. It wants all the lies undone, all of them, every lie this family has ever told, going back generations. It won't stop until we're all back to the truth of what we were before we learned to deceive. God help us, we were nothing." The Whitmore family was found dead 3 days later. Not murdered, but aged backwards until they were nothing but dust and memories. The clock was still ticking in reverse, and according to the police report, it continued to do so for 72 hours after the bodies were discovered, as if it was still undoing lies that existed somewhere in the threads of time itself. The clock was sealed in the basement of the house, which was subsequently abandoned. Over the decades, various attempts were made to study it, but every researcher who spent more than a few hours in its presence began to experience the same phenomenon. They would start confessing truths they'd never intended to share, and time around them would begin to behave strangely. In 1927, a team of scientists from Harvard attempted to dismantle the clock. They lasted 6 hours before fleeing the house. Their report, which wasn't declassified until 1998, described experiences that defied all rational explanation. The clock had begun showing them their futures where every lie they would ever tell was simultaneously being told and untold. Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the lead researcher, wrote, "It's not just that the clock knows when you're lying, it knows when you're going to lie. It knows lies you haven't thought of yet. And it's ticking backwards through all of them, unmaking them before they can exist." We're dealing with something that exists outside of linear time. The house was finally sealed by the state in 1947 after a series of mysterious deaths. Urban explorers who broke in would be found days later, aged beyond recognition, their belongings scattered, as if they'd been searching frantically for something. The few survivors spoke of hearing the clock's reverse, ticking, echoing, through the entire house, even though they never made it to the basement. But here's where the story takes its most disturbing turn. In 2003, during renovations of the Salem Historical Society, workers discovered a room that hadn't appeared on any blueprint. Inside were thousands of documents, letters, diary entries, confession notes, all written in the same backward script that Sarah Whitmore had begun speaking. The papers were analyzed and found to contain confessions to crimes that hadn't been committed yet. Among these documents was a letter, addressed to whoever finds this clock next. The letter, written in Margaret Whitmore's hand but dated 60 years after her death, contained detailed instructions for feeding the clock. According to the letter, the clock requires lies to survive. Without deception to reverse, it begins to consume truth itself, unraveling reality in expanding circles around its location. The letter ended with a warning. The clock is not destroying lies, it's collecting them. Somewhere in its mechanism, every reversed lie still exists, waiting to be released back into the world all at once. The question isn't whether someone will wind it again. The question is, what happens when all those lies come flooding back into reality at the same time? Recent investigations have revealed that the Whitmore clock may not be unique. Similar timepieces have been reported in Prague, where an entire monastery disappeared after acquiring a clock that ran backwards during prayers. In Tokyo, a family shrine clock that reversed time during false offerings led to 3 generations of a family aging backwards until they were never born. And in London, Big Ben itself reportedly ran backwards for 17 minutes during a parliamentary session in 1894, causing every member of parliament to simultaneously confess to their worst lies. The pattern is always the same. Someone seeks a way to enforce truth. They find or commission a clock with supernatural properties. The clock begins ticking backwards in response to lies, and eventually, the accumulation of reversed deceptions becomes so great that reality itself begins to unravel. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this story isn't what happened to the Whitmore family. It's what's happening now. According to records I've obtained from the Salem City Planning Office, the Whitmore house is scheduled for demolition next month. The clock, still sealed in its basement, will need to be moved. 3 different moving companies have already refused the job after their employees reported hearing backwards ticking during site visits. The current plan is to have the clock destroyed, but metallurgical analysis suggests that its components are physically impossible. Metal that's simultaneously rusting and unrusting, wood that's simultaneously rotting and healing, glass that reflects images from the past and future simultaneously. And here's the detail that kept me awake for 3 nights after researching this story. The demolition is scheduled for November 13th, exactly 170 years to the day after Margaret Whitmore wrote her final diary entry. The construction foreman, a man named Michael Thorne, has been having dreams about the clock for the past month. Dreams where he winds it up, and every lie he's ever told comes true all at once. Dreams where the clock's hands spin forward so fast they become a blur, and suddenly everyone in Salem is living in a world where every deception ever spoken in the town becomes reality simultaneously. When I contacted Mr. Thorne for this story, he told me something that made my blood run cold. He said that lately, when he's at the construction site, he can hear ticking. Not normal ticking, but the backwards rhythm that the Whitmore family described. And it's getting louder every day. The strangest thing, he told me, is that I keep wanting to tell the truth about things I've never lied about, like the clock is making me honest about lies I haven't even told yet. The Whitmore clock sits in its sealed basement today, waiting for someone to wind it, someone to lie in its presence, someone to trigger its terrible mechanism once again. And when that happens, 70 years worth of accumulated reversed lies will need to go somewhere. The question isn't whether the clock will be moved. The question is whether our reality can survive the movement. Because if the theories about the clock are correct, if it really has been collecting every lie it's ever reversed, then destroying it won't stop its power. It will release it all at once. Every lie the Whitmore family ever told. Every deception that's been reversed by similar clocks around the world. Every false reality that's been unwound and stored in the space between tick and tock. All of it flooding back into existence simultaneously. So the next time you hear a clock ticking, listen carefully. Make sure it's going forward, because somewhere in Salem, Massachusetts, there's a clock that remembers every lie ever told, and it's counting down to the moment when all of those lies become true again. And if you ever find yourself in possession of a clock that ticks backwards when you lie, remember the Whitmore family. Remember that truth has a price, and sometimes that price is higher than any lie could ever be. The demolition begins in 18 days. Whatever happens next, we'll all find out together. Sweet dreams.